So if you're looking to get a new iPad for the first time or looking to upgrade from an older iPad, the new M3 iPad Air is most likely on your radar. However, given how similar this thing looks to other older iPads, it could be pretty difficult to figure out exactly what's new and different about this iPad. So in this video, I'm gonna help you decide. I'll tell you exactly what you should know about this iPad before you spend your money, or maybe spend your money on something else instead of this. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about the price. So for a base model with 128 gigs of storage, you're looking at $600 US, but that does not include an Apple Pencil or the Magic Keyboard. If you think you're gonna need those, you're gonna be spending $997, which is literally $2 less than the base model M4 MacBook Air, which has double the amount of storage, double the amount of RAM, and it's just a much better laptop than this iPad could ever be, in my opinion. So that's something you have to decide, whether you really want an iPad or a laptop. I feel like most people who are going to buy this iPad will at least get an Apple Pencil. And in that case, you'd be looking to spend $728, which is not cheap. And of course, if you need the bigger 13-inch model, you'll be spending even more. But okay, what do you actually get for the money you pay for this thing? Well, the biggest upgrade I would say is the M3 chip inside this thing. And it's no doubt a very powerful processor for a device like this. You'll most likely see a difference, especially if you're upgrading from something like this, which has the A14 Bionic processor inside. This is the iPad Air 4. So for example, gaming, video editing, stuff like that. I can play Call of Duty on this iPad without any problems at max settings, and it barely gets warm. Like, you can barely feel it. However, on this 5-year-old iPad, I cannot play on the absolute best settings, and it does start to get warm very quickly. Same thing for video editing. If you're someone who's going to edit on your iPad, maybe use LumaFusion or whatever, it's going to run a lot better on this iPad compared to something like this. And that's simply because the M3 chip inside this is a laptop grade chip. You'll find it in M3 MacBook Airs. So it's not really a surprise that this thing is so powerful. Same thing goes for creative apps like Photoshop and Procreate, for example. If you're an artist, this iPad will allow you to have more than double the amount of layers than this can have. So that will allow you to work on much more complex projects. You can even connect it to an external monitor using the USB-C port and actually use it like one, versus on this iPad, where if you connect it to an external monitor, it just mirrors the display, which is not very useful. The M3 chip also supports Apple Intelligence, so you'll have access to some writing tools and whatnot, whatever that's offered with Apple Intelligence. Now, in terms of the screen on the 11-inch model, of course, you're getting the 11-inch screen, and the 13-inch, you're getting a bigger 13-inch screen. But I personally think this 11-inch size is a lot more practical, in my opinion, because if you like to carry your iPad around with you, maybe in your backpack or something, I think this is a better size to get. 13-inch is maybe a little too big. I have tried both. I would say the 13-inch is better for like content consumption, just like watching movies or something on your iPad. Or if you're just like someone who sits at a table and just draws on your iPad, then sure, the 13-inch might be better, but otherwise, I would say the 11-inch might be a better option. Now, in terms of the screen quality, while it looks pretty good, it's got decent contrast ratios and everything, it's not the absolute best of the best. For that, you're gonna have to get an iPad Pro, which has an OLED screen, which this doesn't. And this is not a 120 Hz screen, this is a 60 Hz panel. So it could potentially feel a bit choppy or not quite as smooth as a 120 Hz screen if you're used to that, but I personally don't think that's a deal breaker unless you're buying the iPad specifically for gaming, in which case it might be actually worth having a high refresh rate display, and you might actually really notice the difference. Now, you may have noticed that my screen looks a bit different, and that's because of this screen protector that I've installed. It's from Paperlike, and it's supposed to make your iPad screen feel like writing on actual paper when using your Apple Pencil. And I've got to say, it actually does that. This has something called microbead technology, which adds this very nice and consistent resistance to your iPad screen while writing on it. And that just gives you so much more control over the Apple Pencil. If you use your iPad to take notes, or especially if you're an artist, this is kind of a no-brainer. You almost need this because of how much of a difference I feel like it makes. So check it out. I'll leave a link below. And the best part is that if you don't like it, you can just return it within 100 days. So you really have nothing to lose. Now, speaking of the Apple Pencil, because this iPad also supports Apple Pencil Pro, I think this is the other biggest upgrade you get with this iPad. Now, just like the Apple Pencil 2, it still has the double tap feature where you can tap this and switch from one tool to the other, and it still magnetically attaches and charges to the iPad. But what's new is that now you can squeeze it and it actually feels like you're pressing a button, and you can set this to do almost anything. You can customize this action. And I think this is actually very useful, even though I just used my Apple Pencil for note taking. It can also sense barrel rotation. So let's say if you're using a fountain pen, the stroke will change depending on the rotation. And it now also has Find My support, which is nice, I think. Now, if note taking is the only thing you're gonna do on your iPad, then you could potentially get away with the Apple Pencil USB-C version. It's a much more basic version of the Apple Pencil, but it does the basic stuff. For that, it should be fine. The only other thing that I would say is kind of important in almost every mobile device is the battery life. Both of these iPads are rated the exact same for battery life by Apple, despite being 5 years apart in generation. And this has only a slightly bigger battery than what this has. So that's something I was a bit surprised to find out. But either way, I find the battery life on the M3 iPad Air to be okay. It's nothing impressive, but it's also not something I would be worried about. The only other small new change here is that now the selfie camera supports center stage. So, you know, if you move around, it will kind of track you. And it's now in a landscape position instead of the portrait position on the older iPad. So is the M3 iPad Air worth it? Honestly, I think it depends on what you're using the iPad for. If you're gonna use it for drawing, sketching, or intensive tasks like video editing, right? Then I would say yes, it's worth it. However, I would also recommend you check out the M2 iPad Air, which is very similar to this iPad, but much cheaper. However, if you're gonna do basic tasks like note-taking, then honestly, I don't see a reason to upgrade from even something like this, a 5-year-old iPad. But should you get this as your first iPad, again, I would say consider checking out the M2 first before you decide to get this, because I personally think the M2 will be a much better value overall than this iPad because of how similar it is and cheaper.